Доброго дня усім.
Good
Всім, хто присутній
afternoon,
на наживо,
everybody.
всім, хто
Happy
дивиться
to
онлайн.
see everybody
Дякуємо вам,
here.
що відгукнулися на цей
Happy to welcome
Сьогодні
everybody
Роман Коваль,
who's watching us
керівник
online.
департаменту
I'm Roman
досліджень
Koval. I'm head of the
організації Truth
research
Hounds.
department of
Зі мною
Truth
також
Hounds
Анхеліна Hrytsei,
organization.
дослідниця організації Truth
Today,
Hounds. Далі
I have next
також
to me
найвища
Anhelina
Truth Hounds.
Hrytsei. Then I have
Сьогодні ми кілька технічних моментів. По-перше, у випадку оголошення повітряної
Liliia,
тривоги ми можемо ніяк не
Lakhnech
переходити, тому
with
що
me.
вже на
When
початимуться в
you
укритті.
will hear the air
Тому це
raid
буде продовжуватися.
sirens,
І
you
інше
may
технічне
stay here
оголошення –
in
це
a
що
bunker.
ми сьогодні
We
говоритимемо
are
українською
rather
мовою,
safe
і
here.
тому
And
потрібен
those
синхронний
who
переклад. Будь
do
ласка,
not
навушники
understand
знаходяться ось там
Ukrainian,
за
please
останнім рядом.
pick up headphones
Брати і
for
слухати
simultaneous
англійською.
interpretation at the back of the
Причина, по якій ми сьогодні
the
зібралися, це
reason
презентація
why
дослідження
we
Truth Hounds про атаки на
being
рятувальників.
together
Це дослідження
today.
вийшло вже
This is
певний час тому,
to
кілька
discuss
тижнів тому.
the
Воно було доступне і розміщено
presentation
онлайн. Якщо
about
ви загуглите цю назву, ви можете
attacks on emergency
прочитати файл,
responders in
ще
Ukraine.
одна
The
черга річ, яку ми не оголошували, якої
report
виникли
was
кілька
published
нюансів,
some time
це що
ago.
насправді
You may
сьогодні
find
ще одне
links
дослідження
to
пройшло.
it.
Інше
But the second
носить назву
reason
«Вода на
is that
або «Blood and Fire».
very soon
Воно
you
присвячене
will
аналізу
see
атак на
the next
рятувальників,
research
тих рятувальників, які брали участь в ліквідації
flood and
наслідків
fire.
вчорашньої повені, спричиненої підривом
It was
російської
about
електростанції.
attacks on
Говорячи про атак на рятувальників, це тема, в
responders
принципі, не нова. Я думаю,
who were
для
fighting
всіх
against
українців і українок
the flood
точно.
in
Це постійний
result of
бій.
attacks on
Так
Kakhovsky
само, насправді, ця тактика виходить за
water
межі
reservoir. And
російсько-української
actually,
війни
what we
і
see
знайома
today
різним
that
суспільствам. Зокрема,
this phenomenon goes far beyond the
конкретна практика
consequences
нападів
of
на
the
рятувальників,
Russian-Ukrainian
практика
war.
подвійних
I
ударів
mean,
або
the
подвійних
attack
атак,
on
або
attacks on
повторних атак,
responders
звучала регулярно протягом
could be
десятиліть
seen in
регіональних,
many
локальних, міжнародних
conflicts.
медіа.
And
Зокрема,
this topic
спричиняючи в
on
тому
the
числі деякі
attacks
міжнародні
on
дискусії, і не лише
emergency responders was raised in media and has
але
been
в тому
raised in
числі
media
і на
for
рівні
quite a while. And
правовому.
we would like to look at this topic both at the political level and from the legal point of view in the context of the international humanitarian law. Then you may recollect attacks of the United States on the northern Waziristan in Pakistan, the same practice of recurring attacks on emergency responders was widely applied in Syria. And in the context of Syrian attacks, you may see the same very familiar perpetrator. I mean, the same perpetrator who initiated aggression against Ukraine. And then we may recollect the dozens of those cases what happened during the last 10 years. You may recollect the attacks on Idlib when there were dozens of casualties, and it was the air forces of Russian Federation who initiated that double attack on the market, and then the follow-up attack on emergency responders. And at that time, one could see the pictures produced by the Russian authorities showing the totally intact market, while investigative journalists managed to find the true pictures of that attacks. And had shown the real pictures of heavily damaged market. Then later, the Russian authorities tried to say that the Russian air forces committed attacks on that very day, which was not true. Then you may recollect a recent attack of Israeli forces on Nasser hospital in Gaza Strip, and on that day it was classified as a double tap attack, which perhaps should be interpreted better as a recurring attack, because double tap suggests there were just two attacks, one after another, while actually sometimes we see that there are up to 4 strikes on the same building to the same location. And today, the Truth Hounds will discuss this tactics applied by the Russian Federation in Ukraine, and we will analyze the 4 years of this war. This will be the chronological frames of our today's presentation. So, Anhelina, will you please characterize the main features of this tactics and the data which you analyzed to produce the survey? Thank you very much. From the beginning of the full-scale invasion and up to the end January of this year, we've identified more than 248 cases where the rescue rangers were attacked or currently attacked, and we base this information on official reports by Ukrainian state emergency services and on the open sources. And from this diagram, you can see that those cases had been growing gradually since 2022, while in 2025 you may observe the sharp decrease in the frequency of those cases. Then the geography of that incidence could be limited to just several regions or frontline regions, etc. Actually, they are most evenly spread, but the biggest number of such incidents happened in Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, Kherson, the Dnipro region, and the biggest number of such cases were registered in the frontline or pre-frontline cities. But Odessa, Khmelnytskyi, Rig also were targeted and had seen such recurring attacks on rescue rangers, and this allows us to suggest that they were not limited just to several areas or exclusively to pre-frontline areas. Also, we are seeing some patterns in those attacks. Roman had mentioned the double tap attacks or follow-up attacks, and not only on personnel of the rescue rangers, but also fire trucks, equipment, fire stations. And when we refer to the disaster and strike over Kakhovska hydropower plant and renation of Kakhovsk Dam, we may see that clearly. And today we will focus on double tap strikes and ruination of fire stations, because these are the mostly widespread things. Let us start with the definition. We believe that a double tap or recurring attack or recurring strikes is seen as a military tactics where one strike is aimed at some target, and then the next attack, the recurring attack, is aimed clearly at the rescue rangers coming to the location in order to provide help. And what is a very bright feature, then both strikes are hit to one location. And the second is a time limit. The second tap, the double tap, always comes within a relatively short period of time, between 10 minutes up to several hours. And this tactics has been observed since the beginning of full-scale invasion, when we have 92% of firefighters or rescue rangers, the rescue responders were hit in course of this double tap strike. That is, we try to exclude medical staff or law enforcers coming to help, and most probably the scale of this phenomena is much broader because the rangers working in, for example, Kharkiv region mentioned that there is 90% probability that respondents who rush to help people, that there is 90% probability that they will be hit as a follow-up strike to strike. And this, of course, prevents them from doing their work efficiently. And the natural question is, what is the logic or the logic behind this tactic of recurrent attacks or double tap strikes? While the first attack, the first strike might be aimed at achieving military objectives, the double tap strike may be aimed at complicating emergency response operations and even to make the harm bigger. When they complicate response operations, we clearly see that quite often respondents cannot arrive to the site where their help is needed, and they can not start the rescue operations. For example, there might be people under the debris of a building. They cannot start this rescue work, and this creates a huge pressure. On the one hand, the responders risk very much. They're under risk when they rush to help. On the other hand, those people who are under debris or are in fire or are in damaged buildings, they are prevented from receiving this emergency help because the respondents cannot arrive on time. When the responders are under continuous attacks and may expect to find themselves under attack every time they are under risk, they should suspend their operations. And moreover, their equipment could be damaged in course of that recurring attacks, which again prevents them from doing their job efficiently, and all that weakens the morals of the responders. The second feature of this practice, which we observed, these were attacks on the fire stations, and having observed the growing numbers, we clearly see the dynamics. While it started with just 10 such attacks on fire stations, with equipment, with people, with personnel, with training facilities, and it resulted with more than 60 such cases in 2025. And actually, fire stations should be seen not just as sites where the equipment is stored and where the personnel stays. Fire stations quite often operate as resilience points for local population, offer uninterrupted electricity supplies to population. Many fire stations are also used as bunkers and shelters for population. Then some responders, they are temporary living in temporary housing and accommodation in those fire stations. They, especially in pre-frontline areas, because they have lost their homes due to shellings and attacks. And keeping all that in mind, you understand that in many cases, when in result of attacks on such fire stations, we see not just broken windows like in more than 50 cases, but in around a dozen of cases we have seen bigger and more serious damage committed to the buildings. And actually, in this context, we can say attacks and strikes on fire stations may suspend operation of the responders team completely. For example, Konstantininka fire station was destroyed completely by the by such air attack with a bomb, with a floating bomb, and in result of that accident, the firefighting team had to evacuate from the city. In general, this shows how critical the attack on such a fire station could be. Also, when we speak about pre-frontline areas, we mean the presence of rescue ranger units in these areas. When schools are not operational anymore, even when hospitals are not operational and evacuated from the pre-frontline area and is not operational anymore, the firefighters and other emergency responders, they remain present in this very risky environment. And in order to be able to do that, they should have their fire station where they keep the equipment, where they can find shelter, where they can stay, and not having such a facility may considerably undermine their capacity to provide response. Thank you, Anhelina, for presenting our major findings. And Lily, I would ask you to characterize these two major practices as double tap attacks and attacks on fire stations the international humanitarian law point of view. Since Anhelina had just characterized these two types of attacks, while I will try to provide a characteristic of these in the light of international humanitarian law and how we can characterize it, the crime of intentionally directing attacks on civilian population. The second is the crime of attacks on civilian objects, and the third, she changed the slide. So the war crime of intention directing attacks against the civilian population under Article 8. At the beginning, the Russians tried to say that the responders were combatants, and looking at section 6 of additional protocol, and then we should look at Ukrainian national legislation, how it sets the functions of the civilian defense workers. And based on that legislation, when we compare them, we come to a conclusion that Ukrainian legislation sets the tasks of the civilian defenders in the same way. Actually, as the international legislation, so the rescue rangers do the major work on protection of civilian population, and here we see that this fully coincides with Article 51 of additional protocol. They have the right to be armed and to carry out tasks in cooperation with the military if their tasks is focused on civilian defense, the defense of the civilians. Also, in case when they are warned by one of the conflict, one side of the conflict, and if Russia believes that responders provide, give some military advantage to Ukraine, they should warn that they see it like that before hitting the responders. Never Ukrainian responders were informed about that, and any attacks were supported by such things.
The next qualification of war crime concerns attacks of civilian infrastructure, and here we can refer to the definition of the facility by nature of its function. In the scope of our survey, we were able to identify that the majority of attacked facilities, also double-tapped ones, were located more than 300 meters from the identifiable military target. So we cannot say that the placement was in any case related to the attack. Speaking of the nature of such facilities and the modus operandi of them, as Anhelina has mentioned, it's just fire depots that are many times are used as shelters, as resilience points, and locations of temporary stay for the rescuers themselves in between calls for duty. Also, these are the places where fire and rescue equipment has been stored to deal with the aftermath of attacks. The third type of qualification concerns terrorizing the civilians. And this is not equal to terrorism. Terrorizing is rather forceful actions to instill fear in the civilians, and we can split the civilians into two groups. First of all, the first responders themselves, and second group, just rank-and-file civilians. Speaking of the first responders, clearly there was an understanding that whenever they go on service, it can be their last call, and because of that, their own function becomes a potential weapon against them. That's why Russia is trying to instill fear in both rescuers and the civilians. To say that even volunteers willingly assist in first responders to mitigate the aftermath can become victims of a second strike, spreading further the fear among the civilians that may have suffered already from the initial strike. Those people waiting for a chance to be rescued. Thank you. Thank you. One important moment when we speak about attacks on first responders and finding proofs of such efforts in breach of international humanitarian law. Here is this component when we have to prove the intention, importance, when we are to correctly qualify this crime, this type of crime. And Anhelina, I have a question to you, specifically regarding indicators of premeditated action that we've been able to identify when working with our survey, and generally how the modern war and current armaments and munitions used to attack first responders can further prove the premeditated action of such an onslaught. Yeah, generally, there are several criteria recognized internationally to prove premeditated action intent of attacks. First of all, it's about the type of infrastructure, a military, a civilian one. As Roman has also mentioned, it depends on the type of weapons. Some are more precise, offering more control to the attacking party. And we can also look at the way when Russian sources try to describe the attacks. Not to forget about repeated strikes or double taps. There are several interesting trends to look into to explain that at least part of the incidents we were able to identify were intentional. First of all, it's about the type of weapons used. Back in 2022, 2023, most of the attacks were done using rocket launch and ballistic artillery. Then starting from 2024, UAVs became the predominant weapon of choice for such attacks. And this is an important observation because drones can possess certain features that potentially might allow them to better identify the target and the status of the target. Say, when it comes UAVs mounted with video cameras, we were able to identify lots of videos across Russian Telegram channels showing that those cameras were able to clearly identify first responders with singular uniforms. So making that way sure that everything was positively identifiable as fire rescue crew, having vehicles properly marked with relevant signs, and that would make these attacks clearly intentional and premeditated. Based on that, we also wanted to look into ways in which Russian media outlets and social media channels would describe the first responders and the infrastructure facilities in Ukraine, seeing these as potential identifiers of premeditated nature of such attacks. So we were able to identify 169 mentions of it across Russian Telegram channels, with mentions of Ukrainian first responders. 65% of the messages contained threats to SES staff, 18% of them would compare first responders to active servicemen and the infrastructure facilities with regular military targets. 5% contained accusations of them liaising with NATO and other such mercenaries, and 4% contained direct threats to the address of first responders. There was a Telegram channel from Mariupol to Carpathians with tons of standardized threats against first responders and calls to make them prime targets if they venture into the strike sites. And since 2025, we've started seeing new messages about first responders of Ukraine being imminently enlisted among the qualified military targets. And this Telegram channel from Mariupol to Carpathians is mostly aimed at Kherson Oblast and related areas. And this is exactly where most of the accidents were reported. If we see the rate of attacks post-publication, we'll see that since July last year, when we first saw the the message till October, when the third message to the same effect was published. So the period saw 6-time increase in the frequency of attacks. So we may not establish direct link between this change in rhetoric and the growth of the number of incidents, but still there's a clear concern and indication of a definitely might require a deeper analysis. So in the totality of these factors, from types of weapons to the premeditated nature of attacks to the way these are communicated by the Russian side, shows that in many cases we were witnesses of really intended attempts to kill and maim first responders. Okay, thank you. And I think we shift the focus a bit to speak not about this survey, but rather on the first-hand accounts of first responders who had to respond to the aftermath of the destruction of Kakhovska hydropower plants, when they had to contain the aftermath of the flood. This concerns the logic that did not manifest itself in 2022 specifically, but rather that has existed for eons and ages indeed. You know, if we consider the action of the Kakhovska hydropower plants as an attempt to weaponize, or let's put it as a way of using water as a weapon, we may say that these tactics of water weaponization has been known to the mankind. Sorry if this sounds too, emphatically, for thousands and thousands of years. It has been used as a tactic for a variety of reasons, for different ends. And security-related studies related to security safety considerations, armed conflicts, and so on, seem to have a consensus that weaponization of water resources can be used for tactical ends and for strategic purposes as well. Definitely, this is not an exhaustive list of all the reasons behind such weaponization, but in our context, it's many times the case. At least it's very much in tune with what happened to the Kakhovska hydropower plant dam. So effectively, this weaponization of water means that the party in the conflict destroys a dam to ensure an out-of-control or controlled flooding of certain area downstream, say to minimize military advancement of an adversary, to prevent them from crossing, say, the river, to inflict damage on civilians and the economy. In strategic terms, such weaponization is meant to have enduring, lasting after effects, not just because of the flood itself, because definitely, well, this is something that has long-term impact when it comes to surface and subsurface waters and water tables. But if we look further, it may mean reduced availability of water for the surrounding populated area. And in the case with Kakhovska hydropower plant, I think both factors, the tactical, the strategic one, were at play. So, So we would not dwell on that because of the topic of our meeting today, but when it comes to the text on first responders, and we included that in our report, water and fire-based hazards, we see responders there as a logical step after the burst of the dam itself. So it all was to obviously render impossible any counteroffensive on the Ukrainian side, preventing the Ukrainian troops from going on to the right bank of Dnieper, left bank of the Dnieper in Kherson Oblast. And yes, there are certain arguments to confirm that this could be the dominant logic of Russian initiators when they consider the idea of destroying this hydropower plant. Not something new, but definitely something to speak about the tactical considerations. And we can remember examples from early 20th century, say, Sino-Japanese War, when there was a design of the Yellow River Dam. This was done by the Chinese in an attempt to stop the advancement of Japanese troops. Or we can take ISIS attempt to control the dam on the Mosul River in an attempt to affect the population potentially affected downstream. Of water is by far not limited to the destruction of a dam itself or using water as a weapon. But again, based on the case with Kakhovka hydropower plant, if we check for the actions of the Russian side after this, what we can see there. Can we move to the slide, another slide? A survey I want to mention here is based on in-depth interviews used to collect information, to get information, at least partial information about the ensuing rescue activities. We had a field team working on the right bank of the Dnieper, those stationed in Kherson, for example, first responders among them, and I think 3 people from the left bank, those who were physically there at the moment of the blast. Those were the residents of Oleshki and some other occupied residential areas, and Oleshki suffered heavily from this artificial flooding. In both cases, we see a certain pattern. It may look different by its format, but it has similar nature. Pattern among the Russian side, Russian forces. It was all about preventing rescue operations from happening on either side, either bank of the Dnieper. The format was different, though. For the right bank, rescue attempts were thwarted by artillery mortar fires. The Russians would attack evacuation points. There was a prominent case of the so-called Korabelnaya Square attacked in the downtown Kherson. So it was like systemic attempts to hit evacuation points, evacuation routes, also using long-range artillery, preventing rescue operations there. So this window of response coincided with this critical time when it potentially would have been possible to somehow limit the damage from the ongoing flooding to the residents, to the cattle there, and it was complicated to its maximum because of these Russian ongoing attacks. When we come to the situation on the left bank, again, the format is a bit different, but still aimed at forestalling these rescue operations. There's just a brief list here on the slide related to Russians confiscating private boats and all sorts of vessels to prevent civilians from evacuating. That was a direct impediment to prevent volunteers and staff rescuers from helping people on the bank. And there again, there were just civilian residents of villages and other settlements in the area that would try to save themselves, their neighbors, their stock. Some people would try to volunteer and join the rescuers. From the information we were able to gather, we may say that the information on the both banks was rather symmetrical. Because of certain problems with getting information, like on the left bank, we had just 3 persons we were able to interview, and thanks them for doing that. It was their time to describe the modus operandi of the Russian forces there as a clear indication of Russia's targeted attempts to somehow impede the rescuers or reduce this window of opportunity for them. So why I mentioned the weaponization of water at the beginning of my speech? Because in the research, in the surveys, we suggest to use this type of behavior as another crime when a party that burst the dam to create such destructive conditions intended maximum possible damage from this released water. And definitely attempts to stop the rescuers were part of it. And yes, we pay attention of every researcher dealing with the topic to this. We also invite criminal justice professionals to look onto such matters comprehensively in terms of the overall objective the Russians had. And now, Liliia, in the context of this destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, I'd like to ask you about the international law, how the assessment according to international law may be different from what we've got so far. Yeah, thank you. I think it will be about 2 parts in this response. The territory on the right bank under Ukraine and the one temporarily occupied on the left bank. There's a note on the need to distinguish and to properly respond during the attacks for the right bank. This concerns attacks on first responders. So first responders may not be attacked because they are civilians under IHL. Then the need to take preventive measures during attacks, the whole nature of it means that parties to the conflict during military operations must take every step necessary to minimize damage to the civilians. And in this case, on the contrary, we see active engagement of one of the parties to prevent any rescue attempts for civilians. And here we see that Russia's side is clearly culpable in both considerations. Speaking about the left bank area, an important aspect includes occupation of the territory, during which the occupying side is bound to ensure maximum security measures for civilians stationed there. So technically, civilians in occupied territories should be as free as possible from feeling any aftermath of the change of government. In our case, meanwhile, the Russian forces did everything to prevent the civilians from saving themselves, confiscating their boats, the rescue measures. According to the law, the occupying power should have been involved in saving people itself, but they wouldn't. So the situation on the right bank is more or less in tune with what we can see in other regions when it comes to attacks on first responders and safety of the civilians. And for the left bank situation, it's again a clear breach of what occupying powers should have been doing, and potential mechanisms to bring the delinquents to responsibility. It should start with our national jurisdiction, with national law enforcement becoming involved, cases going all the way to national courts. And I think that in this situation, the most burden will be borne by the national system of Ukraine, though within areas limited to areas under control of Ukraine. And then there's a question of bringing to responsibility those guilty of relevant crimes. Given the workload of our law enforcement agencies, we have an alternative mechanism, the one of universal jurisdiction, when any nation whose national legislation provides for that can bring up a case of international war crimes committed in this situation in Ukraine. The universal jurisdiction may be conditional or non-conditional. The conditional one may be conditional on the presence of the representative of a nation or more than one representative of that nation on the territory of country in conflict. A non-conditional format allows launching investigation without any such limitations. Then there's the International Criminal Court, which can only open a case when the nation cannot or may not enter one. There's a certain peculiarity here. When we check existing trends and the scope of interest of the ICC, we will see that it definitely is a factor at play. So potentially the ICC may include the information on attacks against first responders and the infrastructure into the case materials, also for energy infrastructure. Okay, thank you, Liliia, and nice the final part of this event of today are about responsibility and on recommendations that can be offered in an attempt to alter the situation. If we understand the responsibility accordingly, in a wider sense of it, without limiting it to just some legal repercussions of certain steps, we may speak about assisting the first responders in their rescue efforts attempting to minimize risks inherent for them may sound naive because their work is a challenging and dangerous one even in peaceful time, but and even more so during the war. But still, there are certain indicators that show. Well, first of all, there are facts, say SES is improving its security and safety protocols, and now first responders have armored vehicles and other such armored equipment. They have enhanced and armored PPE they use when on duty. So yes, these updated and revised protocols and improved safety and security measures work indeed, reducing the number of fatalities and casualties, but still this is not to say that we've reached the ceiling and nothing can be done beyond that. We can do it in several ways. This is a recommendation to the government of Ukraine, to any other government, private operators.
Дистанційно проводити рятувальні операції, принаймні покривати певні частини цих рятувальних операцій, певні
and this at least will allow to cover some part of that operations, to plan remote firefighting operations with, for example, with the drones, then to use, for example, drones for evacuation of people. That, of course, would require coordinated action and maybe investment. And in Ukrainian context, this may require first of Ukrainian startups who may provide these rescue operations together with involvement of maybe governmental structures, even civil society organizations, businesses who may contribute with their investments. Moreover, we may mention solidarity. However, it may sound the common sense word, but still solidarity is very important. For example, in the context of advocacy, when we discuss this report, this paper, I would like to remind you what Anhelina said, that those researchers of war who work not in Ukraine but abroad, they have no idea that this phenomenon, that it exists when our responders they are under attack when delivering their rescue missions, and especially this becomes important when think about other countries. Generally, this is to people, but nobody can imagine how intense it become in Ukraine. And my message is that any station solidarity abroad, outside Ukraine, I think this will play a huge role for those who work here, for those responders who work in Ukraine, and for Ukrainian authorities, of course. Ukrainian society shows huge support and trust remember the state emergencies Ukraine is this position in this rank of trust from Ukraine after the armed forces of Ukraine. So in order for responders, for rescue rangers to be able to deliver their mission and to continue their work is important. It is important for them to feel this solidarity. When we speak with researchers from other countries, we encourage them and we recommend them to continue with the research and studies on the attacks on the responders, including medical staff, including journalists, because these are medical staff and journalists who immediately arrive on site, and on attacks on the civilian defense workers who are among those who arrive immediately on site when something happens, when there is an attack. We have paid attention at the circulation of data inside Ukraine, data about such attacks inside Ukraine. And we would recommend to strengthen communication between the law enforcement agencies and the responders, especially says that is to provide law enforcement authorities with fuller information and more systemic information about such incidents when respondents are hit, are attacked, especially when there are recurrent attacks on them. Thus, you can see that we have multiple recommendations and very focused recommendations, which you may find in our both reports about the attacks on responders on one side and in our report about the effect of and attacks on responders after Kakhovka flooding. And now I would like to open our Q&A session and allow you to ask your questions, to provide any comments, any ideas dropped into your minds. And those who are watching us online, they also have this opportunity to ask questions. You may write down your questions in chat and we will answer them. So first of all, I would like to thank you for your research, for your service, and the second, I would like to thank you for attracting attention to this important topic and to the need to protect responders, firefighters, and to the need to preserve their lives, actually. Being an international lawyer, my primarily sphere of interest is the law, of course, whether you distinguish those attacks on responders as a part of the state policy of the Russian Federation. For example, we can easily see the propaganda, the text which are published all the time in Russian mass media. today, sometimes you mentioned the large-scale attacks and the systemic nature of those attempts. Whether you plan to file somehow those cases further. How do you also register this hatred, those attempts to ruin Ukrainian nation? So how will what you will do next with all those observations and information? Thank you for your question. Registering those deeds as crimes against, as a war crimes, we keep in mind that they could be qualified as crimes against humanity on the basis of the state policy, because they are part of state policy. In order to do that, we have to prove the existence of specific pattern, and later on that would allow us to file a case about the crimes against humanity. While we see broader opportunity not just to prove one element of this crime against humanity, but we can prove several elements of different crimes. The systemic nature of attacks against civilian population, and also we can draw attention to the methods, to the ways how those attacks were committed. This is about the legal context of our studies, of our qualifications and analysis. As for the maybe Roman would say, as to we plan to produce a paper presenting the today's specificities that would be similar to the existent report as to what we had seen and observed by October 2025. Our next publication will cover the end of 2025 and the year 2026, and we will present the next publication of our data sets. And also, we will try to fill in a gap in information. Those attacks on respondents are very rarely seen and registered as a specific data set, as an independent data set. But we have made this decision to keep this topic in the focus of our attention and to produce regular updates on the data and on our analysis. Also, we have planned a set of international events with non-governmental organizations, with international organizations, and with Ukrainian national organizations, and discuss how we can improve collecting data about second-step attacks, recurring attacks on first responders. I think this will be very important for Ukrainian law enforcement agencies. It seems to me this might be very useful amendment to the criminal cases which are being filed by our forces. We have developed the ways how Ukrainian law enforcers might group up some attacks, some deeds committed by the occupants, especially when they are committed through the application of some specific type of drones, weapons, etc. And such approach when law enforcers can group up a big set of similar crimes allows not only save energy and resources of law enforcers, but it also allows to bring these charges at a new level and thus suggest that this is a full-fledged state policy of the Russian Federation. Could you please clarify primarily attacks there is and on medical staff, law enforcement officers immediately arrive to a location where the blast inflicted, where the attack was committed. We have focused on the firefighters and responders for several reasons. First of all, we have already paid attention to the others, and we know that in results our reports, there are several other organizations who pay their attention to the attacks against the medical staff. And the second reason we decided to look closely at the responders at the emergency service servicemen due to the narrative used by and discourse used by the Russians against this category of Ukrainian servicemen. As we mentioned earlier, and still you are right, the medical responders and law enforcement officers and firefighters and rescue responders, these are all the categories which find themselves under double tap strikes committed by the Russians. And we started to look at this problem back in 2024 when we published our analysis about attacks on these categories of responders for the first time. And you are quite right. Then when we focus more on firefighters, on fire responders, we do not diminish the role of other types of responders. So I'm Liliia. Thank you for this survey. My question is about the context, about recommendations to international NGOs your recommendation to interact with the state emergency service of Ukraine. So my question in the context of this recommendation is as follows. Whether we can offer something useful to those countries, because only saying that we are victims or we require, I think that's not effective. I think we should offer something in exchange, something useful to those countries. I think that's a precious question because Ukraine might be very useful to those countries. You mentioned responders and in many contexts, and having gained a very rich and negative experience, we can see that all those agencies, they have changed their rules, their routine practices, their approach, and they have developed new procedures how to warn people who remain on site and how to prevent further risks for the staff and for the population on site. Today we can share and offer our experiences, how drones could be used, how different equipment be used in order to prevent additional risks for responders working on site after primary strikes and in expectation of further strikes. Today, in current security situation, look at how it develops all around the world. I think this useful experience could be offered to other countries. In particular, I know that our services of Sweden share this experience with them, and this shows that we can be useful to those countries, and in exchange of financial support, solidarity, we can things and experience that we have gained in result of our work and our life here in Ukraine. I can tell you a very short story from the event which I attended recently. It was a presentation of a documentary which was called Hearing the Sound of Sirens, which is dedicated to the work of Ukrainian firefighters. And during that event, diplomat from the Swedish embassy expressed her gratitude to Ukrainian rescue rangers, to firefighters, and she mentioned that they learned a lot from them. They continue to share this experience, how to work and how to improve the efficiency of rescuing operations. Also, I would mention that Ukrainian responders contributed to the rescue operations after flood in Slovenia, after fires and eruptions, volcano eruptions in Turkey in 2024. And this emphasizes how proactive our emergency services are, and that they have much to offer to their colleagues abroad.
Hello. Apologies for asking this question in English. You had recommendations for technology companies to provide reduced pricing or access to certain technologies. Could you please give examples of, I mean, I was just looking through the report and it mentions, communication, what have you, but can you give specific examples of what you're talking about? That's quite broad or general.
Дякую за запитання.
Thank you for the question.
Це комплекс. Oh, wait, that's fine. Дякую за запитання. Це справді доволі
Thank you for this question.
і широка рекомендація, в
Actually,
такому вигляді
that
сформульована.
recommendation which you mentioned looks rather broad.
Щодо,
What do we mean here?
технології, безпілотні системи, так чи наземні, чи повітряні, це не лише
Unmanned technologies, I mean drones, they include not only the hardware, so to say, but also the software which manipulates this equipment, and this software, unlike the hardware itself, this software is produced abroad, and one parts or preconditions for rapid development of drone technologies require all sorts of agreements and contracts for the use of such foreign software technologies, and we need support and even intention of foreign companies to develop those technologies, the software for such equipment, for such drones, which could be used for rescue operations. Today, we expected to have an officer from the State Emergency Service of Ukraine, and we expected to hear from him about the requirements of State Emergency Service, the needs in terms of equipment, and he might be able to answer your question more. Unfortunately, it proved that he was unable to come today. But still, if you want the answer to this question, I think we can speak after this event, and I may provide you with direct contact with the State Emergency Service, and you may ask the specific questions to them. Also, in the context of technological support, I can say that now many companies, both in Ukraine and abroad, they think about investments to the military miltech, but doing that they forget about civilian defense, while when we think about responders, we clearly understand that they drastically need these technologies. And in the context of civilian demining, for example, you can use drones when you test and observe the buildings after blasts to understand whether they are dangerous for human beings. While investments are more intensive into the military technologies, which could be used for combat, not for civilian defense. While we clearly see that civilian defense, civilian demining, that requires equipment and investment in innovations. I'm Alexandra. I'm in student, and now I'm focused on the Middle East and Mediterranean region, listening to what you said about double tap attacks, it dropped into my mind that those types of attacks is quite widespread in the whole region. And now, in course of my apprenticeship in Hounds, I started to think whether we might partner with the organizations in the Middle East, especially in the context of wars in the Palestine and in Iran. Perhaps we might draw attention to this problem and establish partnerships with organizations in those hotspots.
І в нас насправді вже є такий досвід, зокрема в цій темі, тому що
actually you might know that we have started this work. We have produced a report to go together with the white helmets. There's rescue rangers who worked in Syria, and they were major responders in Syria, which is not under power of Assad.
And this report already contains a section describing patterns of crimes committed in Syria. It was done by white helmets themselves. We also participated in a close discussion they arranged to investigate further these crimes with the involvement of humanitarian activists and professionals. There's no white helmets as an NGO at the moment. They ceased to exist, I think, in late last year, because most of the team joined the newly established Syrian government, and there was no immediate need for their operations. So if there are colleagues who remember our collaboration with white helmets at the time, so greetings, warmest greetings to you all. But you know, we would not like to limit ourselves to the past cooperation. We are working with Palestinian organizations on Israeli attacks in the region. These are known to be rather deadly, and these are not isolated incidents. The next stage of escalation is again going on with double taps. Unfortunately, I don't know about how frequent double taps have been for fire departments. Sorry for jumping from our context to the Palestinian ones, because the format is different, and not necessarily they have fire departments as such. That maybe they have it under different names. But also, White Helmet headquarters and infrastructure had been attacked numerous times in the past. So yeah, we would like to cooperate with organizations from other regions to have a comprehensive look into this phenomenon, to see some convergent points, and potentially to look for joint delinquents in this. Thank you. And probably the last question. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the survey. I'm Hanna Tsehima. I'm a director of that movie about first responders. Thank you for your attention to the matter. As I have been communicating a lot with first responders of late, many times I had to speak to those who suffer those double strikes. And I know from them that since 2026, their safety protocols and certain rules of procedure have been made more stringent for them, which at times slows them down, hampering the speed and adequacy of their efforts. Say when there's a house on fire and the air missile alert comes, they now have to go to the shelters rather than trying to quench this fire. So protocols have changed a lot for them. So my question is, would it be possible to somehow investigate the impact of double taps the civilian population? See, the number of victims, the number of saved during these mass onslaughts on Kyiv and other such big cities. Would it be possible to investigate it more, to seek a potential pattern when it comes to potential court review of the case? Thank you. Thank you for both the movie and your good question. Over to you, Angelina. Yeah, I will join the thanks for the movie. Exceptional work indeed. Generally, we were unfortunately not able to investigate how attacks on first responders affect attacks and results of these for the civilians, given the data we had available to us. But in one of the sections, we wrote that attacks against first responders obviously slow down rescue efforts, and definitely when it comes to repeated strikes, the first responders now have to go straight to the shelters, which means that those still alive under the rubble may be, they won't be able to be rescued. Potentially, this will mean harm and irreparable damage to some an avoidable one in case timely rescue effort could proceed. A person, say, may lose a limb because of having to wait for too long. So maybe we'll have a chance to look into that in the future, but currently with the data available, we were not able to look into details of it, trace this back. Yeah, this is rather an ambitious objective for a survey. It will require cooperation and in-depth cooperation with the state emergency service in terms of data exchange. Primarily, we'll have to speak to local military administrations to see outflows of residents, to see if there can be any correlation identified between the frequency of strikes and the number of people leaving the area. So a big chunk of work indeed. It will also require some quality interviews with local residents, with heads of local communities. So it's just right out of my hand. I'm not sure that this is a comprehensive description of what will have to be done. But yeah, we'll have to potentially look into, potential performance of rescue operations of first responders in both cases, with double taps and security protocol without this. But I'd say it would be very important and instrumental in identifying these attacks as war crimes, given the huge impact they have. So, yeah, several factors have been at play simultaneously from our institutional capacity to continue to open cooperation and collaboration with government authorities. Not every time it is possible during the war time because also of some red tape and other such. So it's rather plans for the future for us, but we'd love to do it and we hope we'll be able to do it. And we thank everyone. I think we are done with the time allotted, but I'd like to thank everyone present here physically or with us online. Thanks to everyone who has agreed to talk to us during the survey. Big thanks to the Truth Hounds team involved in the survey. I'd also like to thank the Howard Buffett Foundation for their financial support. I'd like to thank the Project Expedite Justice, the review for their involvement in the preparation of the survey. And the biggest ever thanks, I hope you will agree with me, go to our first responders who have been saving lives throughout the years.